London, late autumn, 1967. The city was the center of the music world and everyone who mattered was within a few miles of each other. The Beatles had just released Sergeant Pepper. The Stones were navigating drug charges and reinventing their sound. And somewhere in that crowded, competitive electric atmosphere, a 23-year-old guitarist named James Patrick Page was quietly considered by those who knew the scene to be the most technically complete musician in London. Not the most famous, not the loudest, the most complete. Page had spent years as a session guitarist before joining the Yardbirds. He had played on records by Donovan, Tom Jones, Burt Bacharach Productions. Hundreds of sessions, maybe more. His hands were trained by repetition to a precision that most guitarists spent their entire careers chasing. He could read charts. He could adapt. He could hear a song once and play it back with something added, something better. Producers trusted him. Other musicians respected him with the particular respect that professionals reserve for someone who never wastes time. He had heard about Jimi Hendrix. Everyone had heard about Jimi Hendrix. Are You Experienced had been out for a few months. The reviews were strange. Even the good ones seemed slightly confused, as if the writers were reaching for comparisons that didn't exist yet. Page had listened to the record once, maybe twice in the studio late one night. He remembered thinking that the production was interesting. The guitar playing was fast, emotional, unusual. Hendrix used feedback in a way Page had never quite heard before. But overhyped. That was the word he used privately. Not to managers, not to journalists. To himself and perhaps to one or two people he trusted. There's always someone like that, he told a friend around that time. Every few years, someone arrives and the press decides they've never seen anything like it. Usually they're good. Occasionally they're very good. But genius is a word that gets handed out too easily in this business. He wasn't being cruel. He genuinely believed it. He had the receipts. Years of disciplined musicianship. If Hendrix was as extraordinary as people claimed, Page would have heard it in that recording. He hadn't. That meant something. He didn't go looking for Hendrix. He didn't avoid him either. The session had been booked for a Wednesday evening at a small rehearsal space in Soho. Page was there with a guitarist friend, working through ideas for what would eventually become a new project. Heavier, more open, something that hadn't quite taken shape yet. The room had gradually filled with other musicians drifting in after their own sessions. Someone brought Jimi Hendrix. He arrived the way he often arrived at these informal gatherings. Quietly, slightly apart from the people around him, carrying his white Stratocaster in a case that had seen better days. He wore a purple velvet jacket and a scarf tied in a way that shouldn't have worked and somehow did. He looked around the room without appearing to assess it. His expression was neutral, open, slightly curious. Page noticed him from across the room. He recognized him from photographs. They didn't speak immediately. Someone made introductions, the brief kind. Names, bands, handshakes. Hendrix said he'd heard Page's playing, called it clean. Page thanked him. The conversation moved on without going anywhere in particular. For a while the session continued with Page and his friend. Hendrix sat near the back wall and listened. Not with visible intensity. He wasn't leaning forward, wasn't studying the way students study a teacher. He was just there, present, the way certain people are present in a room, in a way that doesn't demand attention, but somehow accumulates it anyway. Page was aware of being watched. It wasn't an unpleasant feeling. He played well when he felt the room's attention. He knew that about himself. Then at some point that no one seemed to mark with particular significance, Hendrix opened his case and took out the Stratocaster. He didn't plug into the main amplifier right away. He sat down, turned a small practice amp to a low volume, and started playing. Not a song, not scales. Just playing. Figures that started somewhere and arrived somewhere else. Lines that bent in places that didn't sound accidental. Rhythms that shifted without losing their center. The room's conversation didn't stop immediately. It tapered. People finished their sentences, then didn't start new ones. Page put down his guitar. This was the thing about Hendrix that photographs and even recordings hadn't fully prepared him for. The sound was physical, not loud. The amp was barely turned up, but present in a way that had nothing to do with volume. It occupied the room the way a smell occupies a room. It arrived before you understood it had arrived. Page watched Hendrix's left hand. He was a technical player who had spent years watching other players' hands, finding the logic beneath the results. He watched Jimmy's hand move up the neck and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who knows enough to recognize what they don't know, that the connection between what was being decided and what was being played was not operating through the usual channels. It wasn't unconscious, it wasn't beyond technique. It was something else. Technique so absorbed that it had dissolved into something that looked like instinct and moved like water. He played through something that started as a blues figure and became something with no name. He played through a chord voicing that Page had never heard on a Stratocaster and found himself mentally reversing engineering, running back through his own understanding of the instrument to find where that sound was located, why it worked, how it was built. He couldn't find it. That was the moment. Not a dramatic one. No one in the room gasped. There was no crash, no reckoning, nothing that announced itself as a turning point. Just a guitarist standing in a rehearsal room in Soho, watching another guitarist play, and arriving quietly at the understanding that something he'd believed about the instrument was not true. The guitar had more room in it than he knew. The playing continued for maybe 15 minutes. It moved, it changed without breaking. At one point, Hendrix played a sequence that began in open position and traveled up the neck through a series of bends and hammer-ons that seemed to quote something ancient, country blues, delta slide, something that lived before either of them, and then transformed it into something that hadn't been invented yet and arrived in that room for the first time. Not a copy, not a reference. A conversation between past and present conducted through 6 strings in real time. Page sat completely still. When it ended, not with a flourish, just with the natural stopping of a thing that was complete, there was a silence in the room that lasted long enough to mean something. Someone started talking again. The moment passed the way those moments pass when people decide, without discussion, to return to the surface. Hendrix looked up from the guitar and noticed Page watching him. "Want to play something?" Hendrix asked. Page said no. His voice was quiet, level. The kind of no that doesn't close a door, but doesn't open one either. Hendrix nodded and started tuning slightly. He didn't appear troubled by the answer. Page picked up his own guitar a few minutes later. He played a few notes and put it down again. He didn't delete anything that night. That came later. In the weeks that followed, Page went back to recordings he'd been working on. Early sketches, instrumental pieces, ideas he'd been building carefully towards something. He listened to them differently now. Not with contempt, not with the melodrama of someone who has decided to throw everything away. He listened the way a carpenter listens to a joint that almost fits, with the specific, dispassionate attention of a craftsman who understands that almost is its own kind of failure. Some of it still seemed good. Some of it seemed like the work of someone playing within a space he'd defined for himself without asking whether the space needed to be larger. He erased those recordings. Not angrily, quietly. The way you throw away a draft of something when you understand what the finished version needs to be, even if you can't see it yet. He didn't tell anyone. There was nothing to announce. It was a private reckoning, the kind that doesn't perform itself. But the people who worked with him during that period noticed something. The pickiness had increased, the restlessness. He would start something, get a third of the way through it, and stop. Not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't far enough. He was reaching for something he hadn't reached for before, something that lived at the edge of the familiar and beyond it. Jimmy went through a strange period at the end of '67. A musician who knew him then recalled years later. He wasn't unhappy, he was searching, like he'd been shown a door he didn't know was there. They crossed paths again a few months later. By then, Hendrix was everywhere. His second record, Axis, Bold as Love, was out, and even people who'd been cautious in their praise were running out of caution. It was a brief exchange. Page asked him about a specific chord he'd heard. Hendrix showed him without ceremony, demonstrated it twice, watched Page's hands learn it. He didn't explain more than was asked. He seemed to find the question natural, as if being asked to deconstruct his own playing was neither a compliment nor an imposition. He was generous, Ian Page said in an interview years later. He didn't perform generosity. He just gave you the thing you needed and moved on. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes. Long enough. Page walked away having added something to his vocabulary. Not just the chord, but something about the logic behind it. The way the instrument could be asked questions it hadn't been asked before. When Hendrix died in September 1970, Page was in the middle of recording with Led Zeppelin. He heard the news and didn't speak about it publicly for several days. People close to him at the time said he moved through those days with a kind of contained stillness that those who knew him understood as something beyond ordinary grief. In the years that followed, he spoke about Hendrix with the careful precision of someone who had thought for a long time about what to say. "I was wrong about him at first," he said in an interview given in 1973. "I had heard the records and decided I understood what he was. I was wrong in the specific way that technical musicians are sometimes wrong. I confused familiarity with the form for knowledge of the content. What he was doing with the guitar was not a version of something that already existed. It was the thing itself, the original thing, and I hadn't recognized it because I was looking for the version." He paused before continuing. "There was a night in '67 when I watched him play in a room in London. I don't think I said much to him afterward. I didn't have anything useful to say. What I did was go home and listen to everything I'd been working on, and some of it I threw away. Not because it was bad, because I understood after watching him what good was supposed to feel like." He was asked whether he felt Hendrix had changed his playing. He thought about the question for a moment. "He didn't change my playing," Page said. "He changed what I thought the instrument was capable of. Those are different things. One is technique. The other is orientation. He reoriented me, and that affected everything that came after." The recordings that Page made with Led Zeppelin in the years following that night in the Soho rehearsal room have a quality that is difficult to name precisely but easy to recognize. There is in them a reaching, a willingness to let a guitar phrase go further than the comfortable stopping point, to hold a note past the place where it would ordinarily resolve, to find the space inside the sustained tone and ask what lives there. He had always been technically capable of that. He had not always believed it was where the music needed to go. He believed it after 1967. The reasons why begin quietly in a rehearsal room in London with a man in a purple jacket who sat down and played something that had no name and didn't need one, while another man stood very still and listened and understood for the first time what it meant to hear something he could not yet do. That understanding did not defeat him. It showed him the way.